Dan Beck, Managing Partner, Synapse Services. So in 1999, I had the good fortune of an opportunity at AIG Environmental to integrate a group of underwriters that were formerly at a company called United Capital into AIG's corporate culture. I had spent the first couple years of my AIG environmental career on the underwriting side, and an opportunity was presented to me to basically take a group of underwriters that were coming out of a company that was being sold, who had some expertise in environmental insurance in the wholesale environmental space. AIG Environmental really had very little aggregation of wholesale business, and we were looking. We knew that there was an opportunity to really capitalize on some business that existed in the wholesale insurance environment, but we really didn't have a good sense of how big that environment was. What was interesting was really in the mid 90s to late 90s, about 70% of the business that was produced by AIG Environmental came out of real true environmental resources in the alpha houses. We did not have a large distribution of business that came out of the wholesale marketplace. And United Capital was up for sale, and Joe Bourne and John Doyle were offered the opportunity to evaluate potentially purchasing United Capital Insurance Company. And what they learned pretty quickly was that the insurance company may have not been the best fit for AIG, but there was a really big group of underwriters that had a national presence, that had a following in the wholesale space. So it was really a function of getting those underwriters integrated into AIG Environmental, and they chose me to lead that charge. So that was in 1999. When I took this responsibility to basically integrate these underwriters into AIG Environmental and really run an environmental dedicated wholesale brokerage practice, I had very little knowledge of actually how big the market was in totality. And what I learned pretty quickly was our first month on the job. I think we had 2,200 submissions that came in, and that was with no advertising. It was fascinating to me to learn very quickly that there was just an immense amount of business that existed in the environmental or in the wholesale marketplace. But what was fascinating was that the business existed, but there was no specialization that existed. So you had a lot of generalist brokers that were calling on large wholesale brokers to help them place their business, and they had no true specialization. When I got to Columbia, Maryland, and I started to learn a little bit about the wholesale marketplace and if there was any true specialization that existed in that marketplace, what I learned quickly was that the one area that there was really true specialization in the wholesale space was in the D&O, E&O space. There had been professionals that had left the carrier side to start specialized wholesale brokerage practices, and they were calling on retailers and really providing their specialty in that true specialization, which was D&O and E&O. From an environmental perspective, you had a lot of brokers that were wholesalers that were running around saying that they had the capabilities to sell it, but they really didn't have a true knowledge. There were only a few that had real true knowledge of the different products that were available by the carriers that were offering it. So at that point in time, in the 90s, it was probably about 8 carriers that were offering business into the wholesale space, which in comparison to where we sit today, we're probably upwards of about 60 carriers in the marketplace, and there's probably another 35 or 45 MGAs that you can purchase insurance from. As I learned a little bit about what existed in the wholesale marketplace in terms of environmental expertise and the various brokers that were selling it, what I learned was that you had all these wholesale brokers who were really not providing a real good understanding or education to their customers or their retail brokers about the products that were available or how to get the insurance placed. And it was really between 99 and 2001 that I started to think, wow, maybe there's a huge opportunity for us for me to eventually start a wholesale brokerage at some point in my career where we could become a true specialist in the environmental insurance space and really provide expertise to retail brokers that's differentiated that what's available in the current environment. So it was roughly around 2001 where I started to think that there was a huge opportunity to potentially create a dedicated environmental wholesale broker. I wound up leaving Columbia, Maryland in that management of the national wholesale branch for AIG Environmental and going and taking on some other assignments. But the itch or the desire to basically go potentially fulfill that opportunity never left my brain. And so it was in 2005 where I finally decided that it was the right time to leave the carrier space and go start Synapse to really ultimately provide a wholesale brokerage that was dedicated in the environmental space. And really my first desire was to be able to provide retail brokers with a external outside expert that could help them go and compete against retail brokers who had an in-house environmental expert. And so in the early days, 2005, there was a lot of carrier overlap. So, a lot of them had access to the existing carriers that existed. And so we really had to sell our ability on how we could help them learn and go present to their customers, about the different ways to get environmental insurance placed. And so in the early days, it was a challenge. It was a challenge to basically win that opportunity when they could go direct to the environmental insurance carriers. Why would they use a wholesaler? Why us? And it ultimately was a little bit of a tractor pull. And then 2008 happened. And when 2008 happened, what was a real big turning point in our business, in the Synapse business, 45 carriers came online right away. And we were in a place where our retail brokers were not only leaning on us for our expertise, but they were also leaning on us for our ability to get them covered in the marketplace. 2008 was the collapse of AIG. AIG had 70 at that point in time, probably 70% of market share. And so now we became necessary to help educate our brokers about all the different avenues that were available in the marketplace. And so it was at that point in time where Synapse really started to have a model where we could build the aggregation necessary to get to where we were today. In 2005, when I decided to come to Synapse, I knew it was going to be a challenge. And it was going to be a challenge because so many people had access to the existing carriers that were in place at that point in time. And so we really had to sell differentiation. What were we bringing to our brokers which could get them to use us to go to the marketplace versus them going direct? to the carrier space. And, ultimately it was a lot of relationship building and a lot of really asking for the opportunity to allow or asking our retailers to allow Synapse to get integrated into their insured relationships. And we worked very, very hard to do that. And once we were able to get integrated into their insured relationships, we were able to show them the value of how we could help get claims paid, how we ultimately knew what existed in the marketplace, as well as help them manuscript additional forms and coverages to better the market from where it was. The business today is a lot different than when we started. The power of aggregation has become very, very real. And what aggregation has done for this business is it's given the ability to create analytics or really mine analytics, which ultimately puts you on a different playing level. If you don't have aggregation in this marketplace, it's really hard to differentiate yourself as a specialist because, you don't have access to the power of data, which helps your customers really understand what they should be paying, what their deductibles should be, what their limits should be in real time. What carriers are the best carriers, what underwriters in the carriers are the best underwriters. So the market has evolved where the power of aggregation and having that power of aggregation in a specialist environment is very, very, very necessary. In 2008, literally it seemed like it was a one-day event where all of a sudden our phones started blowing up and they were like, AIG's falling apart, AIG's collapsing, we're not so certain that they're going to make it, help. And we had 70 to 80% of our business placed with AIG, just like everybody else. And it was at a time where everybody was relying on one carrier because there was so much aggregation amassed within AIG. They had successfully, and I was a part of this when I was at AIG, we had successfully sold to all the attorneys, sold to all the banks, sold to all the brokers, covered the wholesale brokerage marketplace. So much of the distribution from an environmental insurance standpoint was done at AIG. There was Zurich and XL, ECS at the time. Those were the big three. But so much of our business at Synapse and so much of the retail brokers business was really placed through AIG. So now here we are, and AIG is going to fail. And that was what we were all led to believe. And we had a lot of nervous brokers calling us saying, help. And it really was at that point in time, which was a critical piece of a critical point in our existence as a company, where something had to give. And we were very well positioned to help other carriers get up and going quick. And so there was a talent evaporation at AIG. There was new carriers that were started, and they needed distribution. And so we were in a place to really go to our retail partners and drive distribution to help get a lot of these other carriers up and running and started. And when I think back on 2008, and I think back and you look at our growth curves as a company, it was really that point in time where we were really able to double down and help grow the carrier space, but at the same time, it was like the perfect moment for us to really take new carriers to our brokers, because they were relying on years of one carrier, AIG, or two carriers, Zurich. And so now all of a sudden, there's 20 new carriers online, and we're introducing new names and new carriers to our customers, to our retail broker partners. And it gave us just a tremendous amount of validity in the marketplace. In 1999, when I left to go integrate this group of underwriters from United Capital into AIG Environmental, and I started to work with some of these wholesale brokers who this group of underwriters only worked with wholesale brokers across the country. What I learned was some of these wholesale brokers had experts in one area that they were specializing in, and that was D&O. But there was no environmental specialist at that point in time. Very few tough casualty product line specialists. And so when you think about that period of time, like there was no real push to have specialization in the wholesale marketplace. And when you think about where we are in 2023, if you're not a specialist, you can't survive in the insurance marketplace. And so it was really in 1999, 2000, 2001, when I was running the national wholesale branch for AIG Environmental, that I realized that there was a true need to create environmental brokerage specialization within a wholesale broker. And that was really the first point in my career, which I was in my late 20s, early 30s, when I said, this could be a wonderful opportunity down the line from a career perspective for myself to get into the environmental wholesale brokerage business. When I think about Synapse today, it's fascinating because we are a group of experts that live in specialization. So many of our people are really specialized in areas, whether it be the property specialization that we have, the environmental specialization, the cyber specialization, and it's the way of the future. You have to be able to mine aggregation, the distribution and aggregation that you have by the specialty areas that exist within your core business. Because that data that comes out of those specializations is ultimately what is going to make us successful in the future. In 2017, we started to see for the first time that we were being asked by some of the best retail brokers who have in-house environmental experts to aid them with our aggregation and our data. And that was a big change because in the early days when we started Synapse, we were basically starting Synapse to compete against these retail broker in-house specialists. So we never envisioned the idea that we would ultimately be partnering with some retail brokers who had in-house specialists. But what's come of that is the fact that our power of aggregation and data and number of accounts that we've written has made us a hugely valuable asset to them. So we're working with retail specialists across the country now in our different verticals that will access us to go to the marketplace on their behalf. And that was a huge change that really started to change in 2017, 2018. And now, at Synapse, we're working with various experts at the retail agency level that specialize in the verticals that we sell insurance to. Yeah, in the early days of Synapse, and even when I first started the environmental wholesale branch at AIG, brokers were really utilized to just ultimately go to the carriers and get a quote. And that was really ultimately all that they were asked to do. When I think about, where we exist today in 2023, we are there in every component of the placement as a broker. We have to identify the right carriers. We have to identify the right limits, identify, the right deductibles, all the way down the line to making sure from a claims advocacy perspective that we're helping the insured as well as our retail partner manage the expectations of the insured in a claim. the amount of responsibility that falls on a wholesaler in the marketplace today is so much greater than what ultimately existed back in the early days. And I only think those responsibilities will grow. I also think as a company, we are positioned so well in that environment because we spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about what we could do to help our retail partners have more success with their customers, which are ultimately our customers as well. But also, make sure that they're represented, appropriately to our carrier partners.